yeah, sorry, I should say, feel free to kick off sort of with your initial thoughts on the challenges for emerging infections, and then I guess everyone can chime in.
Great. Well, as it happens, Justin and I had been asked to write a paper on pathogen emergence in, I think it was 2016. So I was able to go back and see all the things we got wrong. And it was very interesting. I mean, I feel like my sense of modeling in emergence events is very much that we have the classical toolkit is there, which is R naught and generation time and incubation period. And the classical toolkit came out in this pandemic, as it so often does. And the classical toolkit is extraordinarily good, right? And it does an awful lot for us. The thing that the ambitious pieces that Justin Lesser and I had laid out in this paper were to do with links to novel data like mobility data, or, we sort of said, well, presumably we're much better at denominators now because we have such fine scale mapping of where people live. Presumably we're going to be much better by this stage, we thought, at having an immunological observatory, having a sense of the landscape of susceptibles, and all that will just feed into models and everything will be magically better. And I think that's maybe one of the, and phylodynamics will also change the world. We didn't say that, but that was what we hinted. And so I feel, so the way we had framed that piece was we said that, in a way, infectious disease forecasting around an emergence event is easy in the short term, because next week looks a bit like this week, and it's easy in the very long term because often things settle down in ways that we expect. But the middle term might require unattainably detailed information about biological, ecological, and social systems. And we might be getting at that. And we need to communicate this, we need to communicate uncertainty, we need to integrate all these pieces of information, but we should be getting at that. So I wonder if that's that sort of leapt out at me. It's like how we're leveraging all these new resources to model an emergent event leapt out at me as one of the pieces around emergence. But of course, as Dennis said, you can go earlier and start thinking about the kind of the deep evolution pieces, the genotype to phenotype maps, and how we understand which pathogens will go where, etc. So, but I'd love to hear what other people think before we sort of end up going down some line. Everyone's sullenly staying muted. Fine. I will.
The unmute button. Sorry.
Okay.
I mean, I think something that would be helpful is to know all these set of papers. Where would emerging diseases begin? And where is pre-emergence, and how do different things fit in along that sort of spectrum?
It's a good question. So people who've been to all the sessions probably have a...
Well, I mean, so maybe we should start by treading on the toes of earlier sessions, because logically where you start is, where do these diseases emerge from? So there are questions obviously about how they evolve in the wild, and how some of the things, particularly destructive things humans do to the environment, encourage too much interaction and thus helping diseases emerge. So I think those are probably not in our territory, but then getting closer to emergence, it seems to me there are questions to do with the early stages of emergence, when, for instance, if you're looking at diseases that are out there in the wild, you might make some good guesses as to diseases which are dangerously near being transmissible to humans, and particularly, as I suppose, as our phylogenetics gets better, people might be able to say things like, well, here are several different viruses of some particular family, and actually all they need is one more mutation at the wrong place to get a spike or whatever it is, and they would probably be serious threats to humans. So you might be doing that kind of surveillance, or you might be doing sampling surveillance of human populations that you think are perhaps more likely than others to be in contact with possible new pathogens. And there, so for example, I mean, it's just possibly the case, this is sort of wild speculation on my part, but it's just possible, say, that COVID-19 had actually been around for a little while in the kind of people who in the wildlife trade, but possibly because they had previous exposure to so many other viruses, it was a bit slow to get out from them into the wider population. So, you know, you might catch an emerging disease at that kind of stage.
Yeah, no, I mean, that when I replotted Peter Daszak's data, I was just shocked by what must be the level of exposure of people catching bats and catching monkeys to a huge range of viruses. And so there's the, A, it would be fantastic to sort of sample them serologically, but B, if it's illegal, how are we ever going to get hold of them?
I thought that the is it the Echo Alliance, or do you know Stephen Daszak? So it's
yeah,
I thought that was the kind of thing they did, Andy. They're not
they don't do the serology. They do the virus hunting, but they're not doing any sort of serology. They're looking at the bats, but they're not looking at the people in the trade.
And that seems like...
Was there not some, have people not looked at people in the trade? I thought
there may have been some surveys, possibly in Vietnam, maybe in China, but I've never seen the data from that.
Yeah.
I mean, it cries out to be done, and you would hope, well, you have this thing that what's happened has created the momentum for China to start closing bits of its trade down. But at the same time, if it goes underground, then it's getting harder and harder to get at the people to actually sample them.
So I think these are great, and I'm taking notes. I'm not texting my friends in case you hear typing. So I agree with both of you. I think that the one more mutation has to be paired with the serology piece, right? Because I think unless we understand that landscape of immunity, we're unlikely to understand what can trickle through. But I wonder about our kind of raison d'être here. This is all about data needs, so are we framing this around, if we had beta data, what could we use? Or are we just rambling and seeing what bubbles up?
Well, I suppose that's that what we just talked about could be just sort of perhaps written as a challenge. What can we do better in the way of data gathering and modeling to understand how surveillance, broadly using surveillance as a word to describe the several things we were discussing there, in order to pick up emerging diseases at the earliest possible stage. I suppose there's a second half to that, I suppose, which is there anything one can do in the way of data gathering or whatever to encourage medical staff, doctors, to be aware of and to pick up unusual diseases? I was thinking, if say every GP surgery had to give information on every patient who turned up with seasonal flu, then someone might actually, who looking at a large body of data, might actually flag up and say, well, hang on, compared with usual seasonal flu, there's a far higher proportion who've got runny noses but not a sore throat, or whatever combination of symptoms it was. The symptoms that are being reported, which in an individual patient aren't remarkable, but the pattern of symptoms just makes it look like there's something going on we need to investigate further. I don't know.
But part of me also straight away says, don't always assume it's going to be human diseases. I would have the vets doing that as well, because I think stuff coming across through domestic livestock is equally likely and equally dangerous. Plus, obtaining tissue samples is probably much more straightforward from domestic livestock.
Yeah. And I think it may be that they think what we're describing here, thinking of our overall aim, is something that might end up in the data challenges. You know, can we have data? Can we have, as it becomes easier and cheaper to take samples, so you can imagine a future in which everyone who gets flu, or not everyone, but very large numbers of people who get flu or similar diseases who go to a doctor, get a little blood sample test taken, which is analyzed and put on anonymously on some database so that people can look at it. So, you know, there could be, so the role of data, there's a role for data in picking up emerging diseases, I would suggest. So that could perhaps be a challenge for the data theme.
No, I mean, I think we
perhaps,
definitely need
but
something
more
like
for
people
here.
suggested the Global Virome Project or something like that, and a global serology one, and to have those databases accessible.
So I think these are things that are great, and they have been said before, right?
Yeah.
So I'm still fumbling around to try and figure out what we're saying. I mean, it's actually also great if we synthesize what's out there. But Dennis, you know, the looking for anomalies in large-scale immunological surveys, looking for virome things, looking for anomalies and symptoms. All of these things then connect to the issues of data curation and not having things sent through on fax machines. And this is important, absolutely important. And I think that models need data is something that we should not, in this particular environment, that we should not leave to the side.
No, I think,
Go on.
I think as far as it's a data problem, I think there are a lot of people out there who would love to get their hands on it. I mean, I don't know if you saw the announcement of what they're calling the Trinity Challenge, which is Sally Davies, who was, whatever she was, Chief Medical Officer, and is now Master of Trinity, has got together 10 million and lots of important sponsors to talk about future pandemics. And it seems a lot of that is through a sort of, what can analyzing data do to help? So I think that's a sort of trendy, to use an old-fashioned word, to sort of topic.
But I guess, I mean, it seems to me in terms of these papers, and I mean, there are huge overlaps everywhere. There are no sort of clear borders, but, you know, maybe if we think that a data section might concentrate on general sort of generic data needs and data handling and, you know, good use of databases and everything else. But things that are very specific to particular areas might more naturally fit within those, or maybe it's just everything needs to be cross-referenced with some.
I think we should put it down here, and
yeah, I agree.
If someone else steals it later on.
And I think that there's a grander concept around the things we're talking about, right? Which in the context of emergence specifically, which is the looking for anomalies, right? They're looking for something like getting the data to establish what's normal so that we know what's unnormal is going to be. So I think there is a way in which we have a special piece of data in some sense.
Also,
I mean, it's not simply feeding into models, but actually being used for its own sake.
To pick up on something else you said, that a lot of this has been done before. I think that's absolutely true. And I was saying this morning that in this morning's discussion that I just looked on the Royal Society's papers from a meeting they had in 2004 to discuss lessons to be learned from SARS. And I think, and I'm pretty sure there were other ones, other sort of similar collections, certainly following Ebola, I think, sort of about 5 years ago. So, and yet others, I suspect, to do with various pandemics, flu. So, I think actually, it will be it will, you know, we shouldn't ignore these things, but equally, I think we want to try and present a balanced view. So to see what I mean, I think so. If if as part of a sort of balanced treatment of challenges for future pandemics, we feel that actually it's all been said before, well, then we can restate it pretty shortly and give good references and move on and spend more time discussing what we think are relatively newer challenges, or ones which haven't been discussed sufficiently in the past. But I think we should start off trying to be pretty comprehensive and particularly a big concern of mine is that quite a lot of these things, disappear into, they have non-scientific edges, like they go into politics of various different sorts at the fringes. And firstly, of course, we want to try and treat these in a neutral scientific way rather than taking sides, but that doesn't mean we can say nothing about them. But equally, if they're really important, we need to acknowledge that. So in saying what epidemic modelers can contribute for future pandemics, I think we'd do ourselves no favors to try and pretend we can do it all. We need to, yeah.
I think, go on. Hi, Jasmina.
Hi, this is Jasmina. Sorry, I joined a few minutes late. I'm in between meetings and I'm joining each one late today. Completely agree with Dennis, but I think the main challenge with this pandemic specifically is that we were kind of, it came unexpectedly, even though we were expecting. So I don't know if Jess has been involved with sort of previous, there were conversations about planning for the next pandemic going on among different groups. But when it came, people almost stood and went, oh, okay, what do we do? And they went to tools they already had without stepping away for a moment and thinking, what is the best approach here? And I don't know if I'm communicating this properly, but maybe having that thought process of, not necessarily because some people have looked at modeling SARS or modeling swine flu or whatever. What are the tools that can be used broadly, and then how do we use them? I think that is a challenge we should address.
Jasmina, I'd love to hear more specifics. So when I did my introduction, I was, I felt that having thought about this a little bit, I felt that the classical toolkit in some sense, the R0, the incubation period, all these things came out, and all these things are just sensible, right, in some sense. And so I wasn't sure whether leverage is there, but you're suggesting that somehow that went went down a tunnel. So could you say more?
So I'm not saying that they were suited for the purpose. So the R0 was for the beginning when it was the exponential growth stage, and we could spot what was happening with a fixed pool of susceptibles or a full pool of susceptibles, how it spread within that. Talking about the R0 now, and this is a conversation we have had among different groups, and a paper came out in the INEC talking about RR is an effective number right now in London compared to Manchester isn't particularly the best way to think about it. We should be talking, and one aspect is we should be talking of the R, we should be talking about the dispersion, we should be talking of how many people are susceptible and where the susceptible pools are. So when you have a deplenished pool of susceptibles, you have a completely different distribution of R, for example.
Completely agree. Valerie, I think you were going to say something more. Were you? Oh, you're muted.
No, I can't think now. I've lost the thread of what I was thinking of there.
So to summarize, I agree they were sensible, but they should have been given with caveats rather than just go on completely. I mean, at the same way that now we are talking, this split in scientists and talking about herd immunity or not herd immunity. I think it just doesn't make sense. We shouldn't be talking about that. We should be talking about what are we doing right now? Is what we are doing right now, can we do something else?
I'm really interested in that perspective, partly because, yeah, I mean, I feel like the concept that everything hinged on the susceptibles, which is sort of what you're saying, right? Or at least a large part of both K and both the overdispersion and the susceptibles are really crucial to what happens for this one.
But I think it's a combination is what I'm saying. Susceptibles are, where are you? How many people have been infected? Where are those infected? Are they critical? Are they spreading? Is it transmissibility we are focusing? Is it severity we are focusing? This is what the vaccine will have to look at, right?
So, go on, somebody.
Sorry, I mean, I think what we said before when we were talking about looking at the earlier stages when the things are circulating in the wild, what is different? And here, when I think back to sort of early parts of this year, when the first reports came out on COVID, it was called SARS-like. And to me, that was like, oh, that's okay, because symptoms are going to appear as transmission starts. And it's suddenly the fact that that was different was a big difference. So in some ways, the next unknown, I think the questions we want to ask are, what is this most similar to, and how is it different from that? With as much emphasis on the how is it different as well as what is it similar to? Because you could do what Neil did and take the model, the detailed model he had for influenza in England, but then you have to change it to make it something that's useful for COVID, such as putting in that long period of transmission before symptoms appear. And then the other thing that you did early on, Jess, the massive difference in age-dependent mortality is different from many other things we've seen. And so it's asking those, why is it different, and how is that going to affect model structure? I think,
and part of the problem was that because a large proportion of public planning was for the quotes next flu pandemic, there was a tendency to think that we'll deal with this the same way as we would a flu pandemic. I think there's, I think there's the, what's he called? Rumfeld, the known unknowns stuff. I mean, that's
Donald Rumfeld, Princeton.
Donald Rumfeld. I mean, which appears somewhere in set out as a poem, which actually I think it's. And the thing is actually that while almost everything else Donald Rumfeld said I would object to strongly, I actually think that the stuff about known unknowns and so on is actually absolutely spot on for this kind of thing. And one of the biggest mistakes you can make faced with disease X is to take a quick look at it, say, oh yes, that looks like disease A or B that we know about already, or maybe so we know how to tackle it. We'll just look at those aspects, and everyone's going to wear a mask and stay 2 meters apart, and all will be well, or whatever. You need to be more open-minded than that. You need to say, superficially, it looks like disease A, and let's, just as a holding operation, let's put in place the precautions we would take if it was an outbreak of disease A. But let's all at the same time recognize this is new, it's different. It might be different in some surprising way. We really need to look at it very closely and try and see if it is, and if so, what we need to do about that.
This is an excellent point, Dennis. I was trying to make it. You made it much better. The point was that what countries that had dealt with a SARS or MERS did was they imposed masks straight away. They imposed interventions that they knew may have some effect. So in a way, even within a simulated model, I don't know, but for sure I didn't, and I did later on. I didn't at the beginning simulate a model where you could have some mask wearing as an intervention. And then the second point being, we still are unsure about the asymptomatic infection. We put in the model within to be 70% symptomatic, 30% to be asymptomatic generally, but those numbers come from all sorts of collations of studies. There is uncertainty. Jess, you will confirm this, I hope. So there are still uncertainties. So dealing with it, like you just said, Dennis, and setting this out as a sort of an important aspect is what I was trying to say.
I think that's great. I think that the oh, did you have something, Valerie?
No, sorry, I put my cup down. I do apologise. I need to be muted when I move a mug around.
I keep leaning off to the side because it's my husband's birthday, therefore he made pancakes. So I apologize for occasional pancake snacking. I think that I think our remit is thinking about challenges for emergent pathogens, right? And so I think our remit is about thinking about what the response should be when we know very little. So I think that point about not assuming too much from what has gone before is incredibly sensible, right, Jasmine? That's what we're broadly saying.
Broadly, yes, but also trying out things that may have worked elsewhere in a simulated setting, because that's what we will do to start with. We'll simulate things, should be done as 0.0 in effect.
Okay, and so for example, are you thinking of things like the Japanese cluster busting approach?
Indeed.
That wasn't on my radar at all. You know, I wouldn't have known to try that until I read about Japan.
Me neither, completely. But you know, why did they do that? What made them think to do that? I still, don't know.
Yeah, does anyone know? I feel like if Hiroshi wasn't insanely busy, I would give him a ring and say, what? Why did you do it so smartly?
And then, I mean, this in South Korea. So I spoke to some friends, and well, my friend cannot go back now because there is they have a quarantine system, as most countries do, but there is really strict, where you cannot go and stay in the family home if your parents are going to stay there. This is sort of, I did not know about this method. So it's kind of these, yes, there are stringent policies, there are severe restrictions, but so the question is that we could simulate these in all of our models and explore what made an outcome be, and of course with uncertainty.
This links to the thread we had right at the beginning. We ended up talking quite a lot about data needs, and we were focusing on data needs around the early emergence phase. So
that was going to
wildlife, et cetera. But I think that what you're talking about is, as you said, rich in uncertainty. How do we know how much to put in for the effect of masks, for example?
Yeah.
So how you balance, if we're really trying to model a whole suite of interventions, all of which have uncertainty in them, I imagine that there is the danger that you end up saying, well, my confidence goes from here to the heat death of the universe.
Well, you just in mathematics you just do heat maps, right? Across all possible 2x2 combinations, and you have these nice blue or red colors, and you say blue is good here and here is not. So right. Yeah, and just we have to be careful, and I guess Valerie, you will second this, I guess, because we have a stream that looks at uncertainty and a stream that looks at modeling, and data will fit in those streams in some way. So potentially starting a data stream in one of those papers, in whichever order they are 1 to 10, continuing it downwards towards the last one, and wrapping it in a way might be a way to do it.
Well, possibly. I think it's too early to say, really. We need to we did talk about this a little bit earlier, but we need to see how it's going to work. I mean, data is going to be crucial in all sorts of areas. But what I suggested earlier, and I don't know if it would work like this, would be that some things are fairly generic across topics, and so are probably best dealt with under data, whereas some things are very specific to types of data and the problems of those types of data. For example, here we were talking about looking for anomalies in surveillance data in terms of detecting emergence, and so that's something that seems to fit here most naturally. It might also want a cross-reference from a data section, but I think the main thing at the moment is just to try and get down the points and then see how best things can be rearranged later.
Is there's questions to be asked about or classifications to be made of the ways that viruses mutate as they emerge. I mean, they presumably range from ones which really don't mutate further. They just discover one happy mutation while still inside the bat, which makes them extremely transmissible between humans, let's say, and they get into humans, and they've no need to evolve further. They evolve minimally and just cause a pandemic. And then at the other extreme, I suppose you have things like HIV that relies on continuous mutation to succeed. So, and I suppose in between you might get, say, a sort of flu which initially emerges and finds that strains that spread better perhaps turn out to be either much more virulent or much less virulent than the one that started off. So in other words, you might get a pandemic. So that would be a problem, because you might look at the beginning of a pandemic of such a flu and say, oh no, it's a very mild sort of flu, no great need to worry about it, and then it turns virulent. Or the other way around, you might totally panic and then find it evolves into a much less dangerous, so causes much less of a problem than you were expecting. So
if we go to the epidemiological equivalent of the Dead Sea Scrolls,
I was going to say, Andy's waving the book around, and we need Eddie for that question.
one of the very few copies of Eddie Holmes's book that actually the figure for across viruses, the mutation rate is remarkably constant, and so the mutation rate is constant, but then you have this fact that you've got a sort of 3 orders of magnitude difference in size, but you've got a linear relationship between genome size and physical size. So the bigger ones with a constant mutation rate will have more mutations than the smaller ones. And at sort of what range of sizes do they get big enough so as they've got correction mechanisms? I mean, the difference between the coronaviruses and measles and particularly influenza is that the coronaviruses are big enough to have correction mechanisms that pick up on mistakes that have evolved by mutation. Influenza is right at the small end and it can't correct itself, whereas measles is sort of at a point where you can do a little bit of correction. But as Eddie said, we haven't had a selective sweep in measles since the 1930s, probably. So that physical size thing will interact with mutation rate to tell you when you should be worried about mutation.
So I was going to say, Andy is holding the Bible on this topic. and that is and that is my understanding of exactly how it plays out, right? The mutation rate is about the same. And we have a reasonably good handle on that, but I think the problem is we don't know how we go from genotype to phenotype. We don't know what it takes to invade us. We don't have that sense at all. And maybe we'll get better at that. Like maybe that's where people like, I'm blanking on the name, but people who really do receptor mapping, but I mean, you'd have to do both receptor mapping and immunology mapping. I mean, you'd have to kind of have everything in the bag. You might be able to get at higher risk players. Do you think that's likely, Andy?
Well, that to me is the strongest argument for this sort of global virome project, that if we get lots of viromes, then if we know different ones do different things, then which bit of the genetic code is coding for that? So if we get something we haven't seen before, which bits are like something in this, which bit, that is much, that and our ability to be able to identify what host species that thing came from are the arguments for that. But how quickly can we do this thing of going from a stream of genetic basis to actual function? And my impression is that that's still like 5-10 years out.
And may I speak to the mirror image, which is the immune system. So we have these extraordinary technical innovations, Dennis, which you may or may not have heard about. Like you can do these phage display technologies where you take every virus that's been known to infect a human, and there's only about 300, right, Andy? Something like that. Yeah. And you can split them up into tiny linear epitopes, put them all on a chip and expose all of that to your blood. So figure out, I mean, I could get at least what your immune system recognizes in terms of all the linear epitopes for all known viruses, like that, and with a very small sample. So the technical innovations are remarkable. And this in terms of identifying the anomalies, right? If we had a sense of what normal was in terms of all the linear epitopes we could detect, then suddenly you're seeing massive cross-reaction to linear epitopes from coronaviruses. You might be like, something's up. And you could buy time that way. And I get, this is all of this is going to be about modeling, right? It's all about figuring out ways to define what that landscape of immunity looks like, what normal looks like, how we actually model this peculiar measure readout of what the immune system doing is. But then I think the next sort of, to link back to the classical piece, is we should be able to then say, which is what you were saying originally, what the risk of growth is, and also what Jasmina was saying, right? The susceptibility is a really important part of what happens next. The technology is there. I don't know that we're the group to really grapple with the novel, exciting thing. Well, maybe Andy more than
Well,
I guess we can point to them.
Just to say that I think we are heading towards almost looking at between host linkage to within host modeling here. And having just come from a conference on COVID evolution and dynamics in the States by San Diego University, University of San Diego, and that there were two parallel streams. And one of the conclusions was that they need to be done in parallel. Sounds like we are also heading that way. And maybe we are not the right group to completely, I mean, I definitely don't do any within host modeling on this, but raising the question is almost as important as doing it. Andrew.
I agree.
Within host modeling, I think is crucial.
There's a beautiful paper. There's a beautiful paper that Alan Perelson just put out. I don't know which is still unreviewed, looking at lower respiratory tract and upper respiratory tract and linking it to transmission. So and looking, estimating the R naught in the lower respiratory tract and the R naught in the upper respiratory tract by pulling together a bunch of different time series from individuals. So I think you're absolutely right, Jasmina. There's some really exciting advances in that area, and certainly one can point to them, right? Like you said, maybe raising the question and framing that important.
And this could
challenge
be
is what we're doing, right?
Yeah, and this could be, I mean, if you want sort of an outcome out of this, if it is about emergent dynamics, it's about people keep saying, oh, we work together, we work collaboratively, but really we kind of do our own thing, what we are good at. And we speak to people who we are doing similar things, but maybe joining with people who are doing completely different things by finding a bridge between them is kind of what we could be suggesting.
Valerie, I feel like this time you did have something you were going to say. No? I'm going to keep bugging you until you...
Sorry, no, I was just sort of musing to myself, but I thought I was musing silently. I was certainly muted. Just thinking about the within host, between host, and bringing groups together. But I think the trying to a real challenge that Jasmina just identified is this whole business of getting disparate groups to work together. I mean, it's something we've always tried to do at these Newton programs, but it's perhaps almost more essential now. I mean, when I look at the number of different areas that seem to be needed now compared with the number we were bringing together, well, originally back in '92, and then in 2013 and so on, that it just, everything seems to be more and more connected, and one seems to need to bring more and more bits into the picture, and that's hard, because I mean, at least it's hard for me because I don't know anything about so many of these areas.
It seems like sorry, Jasmina, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the person that we may, I mean, and I can approach them if you want. So there's somebody called Max von Claes, who is at the Robert Koch Institute, and he's advising the sort of equivalent of SBIM in Germany. And they are building within host models, similar to kind of how macrophages attack within the body. And I haven't read the paper. I listened to his talk last night. So this was American conference, and the talk finished like at 9 p.m. last night. So I haven't looked into details, but potentially we could ask them to, if they want to be involved in here, or read at least their paper and think they have a preprint and Medar Hive that we could think of.
So it seems like, in a way, one way to obviously structure the idea of challenges around emergence is to go temporally, right? So to talk first about the questions about the mutation and the sorts of things that Andy was talking about, or that we can refer to the Bible for, and then move on to how that spillover happens. And then, of course, Jamie has written some beautiful papers on there. And I think a lot of the challenges that he laid out in his papers are still open. And we can maybe, revisit them and think about whether there's any new data to bear on this, and then move sort of gently forwards into the sorts of things that Jasmina was discussing at the beginning, which is how we don't trip ourselves up by assuming it's flu. Does that sound largely?
Yeah,
and then
wrap up with potentially looking at overarching within host and between hosts, maybe in a sort of looking ahead for the next pandemic.
I guess I was imagining the within host but between hosts as being at that pathogen spillover sort of early on. But I mean, I guess you're right. It does actually feed in at every stage.
But it would be good to have. I mean, I don't know what it is. Almost like a message which we can shape differently during the paper, but the message that should come out of this paper in a way.
What's that?
Yeah, so what's that? It's a subset of the three things. You just mentioned three things. So it includes all those three within one sentence that overarches it. I don't know what it is yet.
So can I take this on a sharp left turn? So where I imagined this going originally was I was thinking very much about novel data resources that are out there, like mobility data, like better demographic data, like there is a bit of immune data spilling over. Spilling over is an unfortunate use there. And I felt that the modeling community, this came up on a call earlier with Valerie, that in a way, we haven't necessarily grappled brilliantly with how we model all those resources. And maybe we're doing the best that we can, but I felt like at least some of the papers I've been looking at seem to me, so there will be you could throw Google Mobility into your estimate, your projection of the trajectory of RT, and it might map quite closely, and then it might fall apart when RT falls below 1 because suddenly different mobility matters. Or, it might completely not hold in a different setting. And so I wondered whether some of the challenges about how we most rationally grapple with those issues, which Valerie reminded me on that call, is very much about model misspecification. So how we grapple with the fact that we never observe transmission, right? This is all of the problem, is we never actually observe transmission, and we're trying to sort of, we do the bottom-up approaches of really getting to grips with how the virus persists on surfaces and spreads through the air. And we have this top-down incomplete vision of cases, which is often under-observed, and patterns of how people are moving around and stuff. But how we sort of close that gap, sensibly close that gap. We have to get at the currents of transmission, we're often relying on very nuanced contact tracing data, and it is shocking that we don't have more detailed contact tracing data, given how much we know is out there. But how you build between the contact tracing data and then the Google Mobility flows to make a sensible prediction about, in Greater Manchester on a Tuesday at this time. I don't know that, is that something that people see as a challenge, or is that sort of irrelevant?
I think that's an excellent way to go.
I agree.
Agreed.
Say something else.
Well, I agree that we could be using a very kind of well-stratified social networks, very well-stratified mobility data to fit in and to make a sort of a small scale right then on this moment. What does it look like? Now, I think there is a challenge in predicting this for a longer time. So we need to be predicting for the next, say, couple of months with the strength of the models that we have.
Right. And I guess that also links to the sort of at the heart of modeling for policy, this issue between, we're not always forecasting, right? We're often trying to put ourselves in a good position to contrast different scenarios. So you might need different levels of, because you want to compare different policies. So it might be okay to get the RT effect wrong, with the link between mobility and RT wrong beyond a certain stage, if that still gave you the right answer in terms of whether you should be investing your dollars in contact tracing versus imposing a lockdown.
Yes, and you have a range of uncertainty, and you say, well, subject to this being like this, then I would I am okay to invest my dollars in here rather than there. But if I make this change, then potentially I have to split them.
I feel like this is a line of thought that was articulated to me by Valerie last time I was rambling wildly.
I don't remember this. You sure it was me?
It was definitely you.
I know I have a bad memory.
Valerie, I think Jess really wants you to say something.
Well, Valerie's wiser than all of us, so I just feel like
absolutely not. And I'm really not in my comfort zone in this area. But I think it would be really useful to say something about data, novel sorts of data, and how best to use those in terms of detecting emergence, and and what we can say about well, contacts, basically. I mean, somehow we've got to get beyond just sort of putting an arbitrary parameter value for the contact rate and then sort of gradually changing it up or down. I mean, that might be enough for some purposes, but it's not really going to distinguish between different sorts of interventions. So I think that's really important. I think the whole business of looking for emergence in anomalies in all sorts of data, things that are changing, that would be really good to know about. So I think data's obviously important, but I think, and making the point about, I'm just summarizing here really, making the point about unknown unknowns, and being prepared to look for something we haven't, that's not identical to something we've seen before, and remaining sort of flexible, all those things. But I'm not really sure what it was that Jess thinks I said once before.
I guess it was, no, but it's exactly the which you just said again, which is an awful lot of what we do to model interventions is we move a contact rate up or down. And I think that's a crisp way of saying, how can we use new data? How can we make this better? And Jasmina has made the point that, of course we model with uncertainty, of course we propagate the range of futures, but is there a piece where we can figure out how we do that bit better?
I think that would be really good if one could do that. But it may be that one needs to do it, or it would be sufficient to do it in little sections of the one might be able to model a small component, not trying to have an all singing, all dancing model, but just look at effect in some fairly small thing where it would be feasible to try and model in some detail different sorts of mechanisms and contacts and so on, and get a better handle on what's going on. But I think there's this gap between the nice simple models, which are very robust, but don't give you the information that you need when you start putting in all these NPIs, and these incredibly detailed things where you need parameter values for everything. And that always seems quite arbitrary to me. I mean, it's fine if lots of people do different models and make different details, but come up with the same sorts of conclusions. That's all very, very reassuring. But it's when they don't that, of course, you get stuck. So I just think that there's more to do there somehow. But
one thing that might be useful there, just as we need a sort of a global serology database, but it would be nice, more from the modeling perspective, to have those wonderful Mousson diagrams of background interaction rate between people of different ages in different European countries, having those for non-European countries to see if mixing patterns are different, say in societies with different religious backgrounds or different economic challenges. Because if these things spread into different communities, it could well be that the way they move through different societies is determined by the social structure of that society, and having better data of that ahead of time would be useful. And then, will the same social interventions that we're trying to bring in at the moment work the same way when people are connected together in different social organizations?
That's a good point. Just do you know if I know that MarkJIT is doing some more work on it, but I don't know if those are going to be upgraded.
So I think there is quite a lot of work in this space, right, Jasmina? You're absolutely right. I think MarkJIT, and then there's that paper that everyone uses. Does that extrapolate from household structure? I'm not quite
Oh,
sure.
the Polymod one. That's the one, no?
So Polymod is the
Mosong.
the foundation, but Andy, there is one that people use for all other countries in the world, some of which is integrated from surveys from those countries, right? So there has been an expansion
But my
in the age
understanding
dimension.
is,
Go on, Jasmine.
but my understanding is that they just extrapolate with the statistics from Mosong. They didn't run the surveys, no?
Yeah, and there are a few surveys, right? There's like one in Kenya, but you're absolutely right. It hasn't been grounded in most of these settings. And I don't think, and no one's done the like, let's move beyond age as our structuring variable.
Right.
So
But I guess
that might be, sorry to interrupt, that may be an important point and to make. Yeah.
In the data again.
Yeah, in the data again, but again, you know, through all the aspects, it will be an important aspect of modeling because, of course, if we have a better grip on contacts in a low and middle income country compared to a high income countries, you get completely different, right? Because everything is driven with this transmission parameter, which within that or proportional to it is the contact matrix.
So I completely agree. So someone who's worked with Mosong and these other ones and looked at some of the others, I mean, they all look kind of the same, right? They're diagonal, and then when you're old enough to start interacting with very young kids, that's just apparently what humans do. But the problem always, so I've used them for measles and rubella and that sort of thing. The problem links back to what Valerie was saying, which was, you know, we're calling this transmission relevant contact. We don't know if it is.
Yes, indeed.
So there's still that issue, and I think that is one where people have. Some of those Dutch groups have come up with clever ways of trying to wobble them so as they best match what we think is happening. But it also links to an issue with another source of data on contacts, which is the mobile phone data, which I've also used. Again, you don't know if this is disease relevant mobility, if this is, you know, the sorts of mobility that leads to transmission. We're just using it as a proxy, which is where model misspecification, where, you know, all of these pieces suddenly become an issue again. It's probably broadly fine, right? Because most people interact in that way, but I think it's, especially when, as for in the world we find ourselves in, the nuances of heterogeneity in contact are incredibly important. I don't think we have the ability to, one, you know, we don't have the data to get at those nuances in contact, and two, even if we did, I don't know that we could translate the things that we measured into transmission relevant pieces because of, again, what you were saying, Jasmine, of the importance of super spreading and all these sorts of, you know, where the subtleties, where the pockets of susceptibles might be.
And we sort of overcome this by these, hence the name bubbles of, you know, grouping things together like we expect, and the rule of six, but they're such broad concepts that again can be misinterpreted. And people don't understand why is it the rule of six, because, you know, we understand it halves the number of transmission based on average number of people that you would have normally. But it's, you know, that level of explanation to everybody is important.
Never really totally grasped that one, I must say, because although obviously you're trying to reduce the number of contact, what seems to happen quite often is that people split their contact. So whereas they would have had one group of 8, you now have 2 groups of 6 with an overlap. The total, I mean, you know, it's not totally clear to me that it restricts the contacts very much. You've still got a lot of mixing between, but it's not like having bubbles where, you know, you stay in that same group of 6. You know, a family wanting to get together for somebody's birthday may well have several sub parties with just a few people missing each time. So you're cutting out some contacts, but not vast numbers.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, it's unclear to me also completely how the rule of 6 was formed based on sort of results that we have from the models.
What was it? Did it come out of the models?
So it suggests, so the 6, the number comes because generally on average you have 13 number of contacts, and so you want to reduce that number of contacts by half, it's about 6. But then how did the 6 come where you kind of have a network system as you just described? 6 here with a branch with another 6, that's not 6 contacts, that's 7, no? But it's important
again,
to note, I think, not necessarily criticize, but note the clarity and around this. This would be probably in a decision-making paper. There will be one, no?
Policy.
Policy, that's the one.
I'm staying away from that one.
Yeah, I also was staying away from that one. That was this morning, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, we had some discussions this morning. But again, like all these things, the areas are quite broad, and what should go in that is not totally clear. But we had some interesting discussion.
Okay. So I think that what we're talking about is the pain and anguish of trying to get at transmission relevant human contacts, right? and then from that follows the pain and anguish of trying to describe ways of making those both humane and yet reduce disease transmission. But that's the policy piece. And I think that the rich arrays of data now measure, so from Polymod, and maybe there's Polymod in other settings, but also mobile phone data, blah, blah, blah. I actually reviewed a paper, I forget, I don't know what happened to it actually, but it actually had, so one of the issues with things like the mobile phone data is that because of privacy, which is very important, you have no demographic details on the information, on the people involved, which is fine, and as it should be broadly, but it means that we have very little handle on, if it's mobile phone data, are there no children moving as part of this network, in which case it's kind of irrelevant for measles, and yet we use it for measles. So, but I did see one which had age structured mobility in it, which that data had become available. So I think there is going to be rich new releases of data around this space. Still the issue that we don't necessarily know that this is a transmission relevant contact. And of course, with models, what we can do is we can group together broad categories of so we can say households versus schools, or does age matter more than household structure? There's some lovely work, actually, I think Lorenzo Pellis did some that contrasted, given what you needed to know, which form of structure did you need to put in your model? Because I think that's as Valerie says, we don't necessarily want to be pushing for everything in the kitchen sink all the time.
Right.
We want to figure out how the models can push forward, maybe push forward also a sense of what data is most important. Maybe that's another, to sort of loop it. Maybe that's where we close. I don't know, actually, Jasmina, but what do you think about this? We close it back around by saying the models can point to the data that is most urgently needed. That's always a nice get out clause.
Yes, but I think it's a loop. It's a get. That's what I was thinking. So, but I think it's a loop. So they will point out the data that is most useful, and then feed back into exploring it in the model to see the use of it and what that means. So yes, but bringing it back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's like a circular thing. You need more data, but you need the model to tell us how much data you need. Once you have the data, you run it, you see, do you need more or do you have enough? And is your prediction accurate? And how do you measure accurate? Let's not go there.
But I think also that, this links to what you were saying at the beginning. That loop tells us one thing, if just done in that way, but what models allow us to do is to look kind of beyond that and say, what if I'm missing this huge piece? What if I have no measurements on this thing? And how wrong will I be? And therefore, how much do I need to push for measurements on this thing?
Yeah. So I agree. But I think I make, yeah. Sorry, I will go in a loop myself if I say anything.
I'm definitely in a loop this morning.
But I think also the other thing is, and I don't know if you talked about this at the beginning, so the papers from the 2015 epidemics do make good points. So I think we should take them as a basis and build from them. So whether sometimes we iteratively say that the things that are mentioned there are important and still remain important 5 years later and amidst a pandemic, but then different things have come out of this pandemic that are also important and were noted because we were not in the midst of a pandemic then. And I think that's how I saw the value of doing challenges papers now.
Was there a emergent pathogens one? Did I
Well,
write that one?
There was a planning for, wasn't there planning for future ones?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it must have been there must have been because Jamie. So
I don't know
I'm
what
sure
it
there
was called.
something, but I don't.
There was something, I don't know, maybe it was planning for, I don't remember what it was called. I can't open it right now. But if there wasn't, then it would have been hidden messages within
here
the
we
other.
go. Jamie et al. 9 challenges in modeling emergence of novel pathogens. That sounds
Yes.
like something we should read.
Yes, yeah.
doesn't
So
it?
and so the point being that whatever they say there, we either say we agree and we think they're still relevant 5 years later, or they were relevant then, but they were more theoretical. We are now in the amidst pandemic and therefore sheds light on these more than those. Does it make sense?
I threw the link in the chat.
Yeah.
And it maps onto our discussion broadly.
Yeah.
But I guess it doesn't walk into the emergence and the modeling, of the world we're in so much.
Yeah, I think challenges span reservoir dynamics, cross species spillover and outbreak dynamics. That's a little bit kind of past. We should be doing it right now. Has happened, outbreak dynamics, decision making. And then the last bit, it's about data. It's about data, that the point you made. I'm reading the highlights. I mean, they actually mentioned epidemiologic and genetic data, which is, so we could spin that to within host and between host modeling.
Well, certainly we don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we should refer not just to there, but to other places where challenges have been identified. And
there was another four
how we can
challenges
update
paper.
them.
There was, bless you.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
Ragweed season or something. Yeah, I think that like in the introduction, we could point to this one, say what things resonate and which things perhaps, I don't know, I'll need to look at it more carefully, and then surge into the sorts of things we've been discussing now. I think the way people are talking about, like, as it were, the global virus, what is the global virus project thing called again, Andy? That has much more prominence now, right?
Yeah, well, there's that, and there was the earlier thing that was the welcome one that was initially just for Vietnam, and hopefully, yeah, the Global Virome Project, I think, is still going under that name.
Yeah. So I think, go on, Andy.
I was going to say that's good. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, actually. Again, it goes back to my first question, which is having sort of defined where we begin. Where does emergence end?
But does it end?
I mean, and it sort of gets back to the, once herd immunity, one way or another, emerges, or once so many people have been exposed, are we beyond emergence then and then begin to think about endemicity? Or is emergence when we manage to eradicate it before it becomes endemic? Which, quite a lot of things we've done, but could we define when we give up, or when we psychologically switch from thinking this is something that's going to go away to this is something we're always going to have to live with? And how does that change the tactics of how we deal with it?
I was thinking of emergence as being very early early stage.
Yeah, I think I was going to say it's in sort of human lifetime thing. The emergence is well, emergence once the thing is fully fledged as something that can transmit among humans with an R naught greater than 1. I think so. In other words, it can sustain human transmission. Well,
Yes.
there'll be things
Yeah.
that. You know, I think you then go into. I guess you then go into sort of, pandemic has got going sort of mode of thought, where sure, one of the things you might try and do is stamp it out before it can get far, which we would all love to do. But I don't think that's emergence any longer. And I suppose there are, again, I suppose you could have questions of whether it's still hanging around and could come back, or whether you've really got rid of it in some more final sense. But I think you're out of emergence at that stage.
Yeah,
Then you're into R naught paper territory, which I think we were living in a week or two ago.
right.
I think emergent to me sounds able to transmit and sustain transmission. So it emerges as a virus, but isn't suppressed straight away, but it can sustain transmission.
Well, exactly, because I mean, from Mark Woolhouse's talk, I remember one of the takeaway messages was that there are a lot of viruses which have got into humans and can be, well, maybe once they can be transmitted, they tend to evolve into something that gets an R naught greater than 1. So maybe there are not that many on the fringe. I was going to say there are.
But
the other can get into humans that can't be passed on, which I think Mark was implying was rather a dead end. If a virus, the kind of virus which can cause illness in humans but is not transmissible, turns out, and if Mark is to be believed, to be very unlikely to develop the ability to transmit between humans. But one that can transmit between humans just a little bit might finish off the emergence process.
So not sustain, but just be able to transmit. That would mean among humans.
Yeah.
Until a possible vaccine is available, because like measles and mumps and those are not emergent anymore because we have a vaccine against them.
Well, I think they emerged a long time ago. They're in their old age now, hopefully.
Yeah.
But
and they've been endemic. Before vaccination, they were endemic. I mean, you could. I think either way, right? I think this is what Andy was saying. If we don't develop a vaccine, this coronavirus is likely to go to endemicity. If we think that secondary infections are much milder than primary infections, we'll move to a world where most people get it as kids. I think that's all beyond the remit of what we're trying to do, right, Andy?
Yeah. That's what's trying to.
So I think that one of the things we can continue down this line if people think it's interesting, but I mean, I think our remit is when it dribbles over from a zoonotic reservoir and then it starts on its trajectory of exponential growth, and we're all desperately trying to find out ways to make our lives manageable. I think that's where we sit.
Because at that stage, insofar as it is ever going to, it is a relatively stable member of the of biodiversity. It's the
interesting definition,
and it's something. So it's now in a form where most of all we really need to understand it. So for instance, its properties such as the routes under which it's transmitted, and at least roughly the balance of importance among those can reasonably be regarded as relatively fixed. In other words,
another way of doing that.
Yes, you can catch it from door handles, and yes, you can catch it if someone sneezes over you, and either you can or you can't catch it from aerosols. Now, obviously, if it mutates further, the relative importance of those modes of transmission might go up or down, but it's a fairly fixed quantity from the point of view of understanding it. Whereas the whole point about the emergent phase is that it's going from something, from the grandfather who had nothing to do with humans through the parental generation who could cause a bit of trouble among humans but couldn't spread, into this generation which is now able to really spread among humans.
Then that would suggest a definition. It's no longer an emerging disease when the average age of infection is significantly less than the average age of the population.
But that's talking about sort of endemic term, assuming it gets to endemicity, isn't it?
If first comes in, it's got to be the average age of infection is the average age in the population if it's purely random. And as it becomes endemic, more and more people are older have had it, so that has to shift.
So that
presupposes some sort of immunity, though, I suppose.
That presupposes immunity. Yeah, that's right.
So I mean, the point is, I think that that's assuming it will get to endemicity, and if it gets to endemicity, it almost certainly has gone through an intervening pandemic phase or several pandemic phases. So I think at the point at which we recognise as emergent, we don't yet know that it's going to be a pandemic. See what I mean? If we know it's going to be a pandemic, we've already moved on to the following week, and we're looking at the grown-up virus as it starts to make its way around the world.
I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if anyone's done this for epidemics before, but people plotted out the time series of what's the frequency distribution of ages at which people are infected, and how does that change as the epidemic progresses, and does that tell you anything?
I think it's going to be wacky for, as it were, flu, right, Andy, for all the original Acinix and headaches. And I think it's probably, I mean, for things that seem to be more continuous in their immunity or sort of a general smooth curve of cross-reactivity, you might get the sort of things you're talking about. Can I take us down a different rabbit hole? So one of the things that Mark Wall has said in his talk, which I think links to our conversations about our models, is one of the challenges, sensibly deploying models to use the novel data in the best possible way, is he said really intriguingly, I don't know if any of you remember this, in the closed session, that he didn't think that phylogenomics had delivered on its promise. Were you there for that, Andy?
I didn't hear that, but it's a very Mark thing to say.
And I thought, wow, really? And I thought that was really interesting, and I wondered why. And he didn't really say why, but I wondered if any of you had thoughts about that.
He was testing to see if Eddie was still listening or not.
Well, maybe that's from some kind of rather extravagantly optimistic point of view, that when we got to understand the phylogenetics of viruses, we'd be able to say, oh yes, we can see exactly how you would turn into a successfully emergent virus, and you look at another one and say, no, there's really no danger of this turning into a human disease because of X, Y, Z. Though, I mean, I think some things along those lines are possible. I think people can look at some of these animal viruses and gives some sort of idea of whether they're likely to be become human transmissible. But perhaps Mark was thinking from some sort of rather like you might say. The aeroplane industry has been a big disappointment, because back in the 19th century, we imagined that in 100 years' time, everyone was going to be able to sort of walk out the door of their house and get on their individual flying machine and make their way around, and that hasn't happened. So, so aviation's a big disappointment. So, in the same sort of spirit, if you imagine just how phylogenetics might have turned out to be some kind of magic way of looking at the virus world that told us everything we'd ever want to know.
I think it's more like phylodynamics is dead, long live the viral genome project.
So my sense was he was talking more about the lovely stuff that Trevor Bedford does, right?
Yeah,
Like so,
yeah.
so that. But I don't know why he felt that it hadn't delivered.
Yeah.
I mean, is it because he was that one was imagining one would be able to say, all right, this viral strain in Edinburgh came from Glasgow. We're going to build a wall. I don't know. I don't know quite. I just couldn't quite imagine what the.
Maybe it just doesn't work.
Remind me what-
I'll write to him and ask it, but maybe it just doesn't work for Mark. It could be. What's Biodynamics ever done for me?
Remind me what Trevor's speciality is there. Sorry.
So he did the beautiful. So he looks at all the strains, for example, of corona, and then he looked at from that built the trees that showed you how the strains had travelled across America, right? So the first introductions in Washington were from blah.
The Swedish outbreak perhaps is largely caused by a strain that came via Italy or something like that.
Exactly. So it should be able to pin down the geographic spread in ways that we just don't have otherwise. And I mean, the other thing that people often say about that kind of data, right, is it gives us another way of measuring R naught, because you can back R naught out of those things. So we have a sort of a validation or an R naught or RT or whatever it is you're looking for. We have a cross-referencing on our case numbers, which we know are dreadful for many reasons. So I just, so Andy, write him and say, what's up?
So I mean, yes, it seems to me phylogenetics had a lot of really illuminating successes like that, and maybe there are more to come, but I feel it's a bit mean to be disappointed at this stage.
But maybe it was the actioning. I mean, maybe all the theory is there and all the data is there, but it just hadn't turned into, you couldn't sequence a thing now and say what happened. Maybe that's what he was frustrated by. I'm not sure.
I'll write and ask.
Another huge success, really. I mean, it's just is the way that that from the disease first being picked up on in Wuhan in the mid-December or whatever, that we had its genome online on the 8th of January or whatever. I mean, it seems to me that's staggering when you consider what was possible a generation ago.
Well, I think also the information about the numbers of introductions into different places, so that you could see.
Yes. I mean, here in Scotland, so that
you knew
apparently we
wasn't one source, but lots of separate sources, which gradually.
Yeah. So I mean, here in Scotland, at a stage where people possibly thought that there'd just been one or two introductions, but there'd a few super spreading events had allowed them to get quite a hold. But there's quite early analysis suggested that actually, I think over 100. There'd been over 100 different people had come into Scotland with the disease, and so.
Well, and that's where you got. Sorry, I was going to say that's where you got the information about all the introductions into the UK from people's skiing holidays at February half term and all that sort of thing, which
I personally hold my sister responsible.
Sorry?
I personally hold my sister responsible.
I think there were quite a lot of people were responsible.
Yeah.
And I know a few.
I'm just listening on this. I nothing to add. I was skiing at the time, so I'm not at all.
I think you have got something to add.
I haven't had it, touch wood.
You probably met my sister, so don't tell her what I just said. Right here.
Okay, so one last rabbit hole. So I think I've Dennis keeps mentioning evolution, and I keep kind of being like, because there's some lovely. Every time people have said, oh, it's evolving to being more virulent, or oh, it's evolving to being more transmissible, I don't think there's any way you can say that at this stage, given the data available, right? Absolutely none. But one thing we can do with models is we can scope the future and identify how big that selective advantage would have to be, given trade-offs, blah, 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 blah. So that is something where, the only way is a model, really. But I don't know if it's helpful, given that we know so little about so many pieces of this. So I wondered if people had thoughts on that.
Well, I talked about it a little bit in the section last week. there are huge similarities between COVID and the mycoplasma in house finches, in that transmission occurs before virulence is expressed. So we've done some general models for that about 10 years ago. As we said, the best way to keep something secret is to publish it. But there, because the trade-offs occur in a different way, then that simplest bare bones model of having transmission occur before virulence is expressed, if you make a adaptive dynamics model for evolution of virulence, then that creates the possibility for virulence to increase as the thing begins to evolve. But you don't get virulence evolving until you've got sufficient levels of previously exposed people in the population, or previously exposed hosts in the population, which we might call herd immunity, that the virus begins to meet hosts that have been infected before. So it needs to express itself differently to be able to not have to keep dealing with the immune system that's primed to deal with it. So in the house finch, it does that by there's then selection to become more virulent, and that is driven by appearing immunologically different. And the one thing we've begun to see with COVID evolution is there are the neutral mutations that tell us where it's been, but there are a couple of mutations that seem to be expressing different surface properties. And that would lead to this immunological arms race, which again, asymmetrically, given that transmission before virulence, might shift towards becoming more virulent.
So is it the one I just threw in the chat, Andy? Is that the paper? I just threw a paper in the chat, or is it one in AmNat?
It's in the Royal Society. I'll put it up there. Is it this one? I can't. It's Osnes and Dobson. No, it's not that one, but that was quite good.
I'm sure they're all quite good.
No, it's Osnes and Dobson. It's 2010 or 2011.
Evolution, not biology letters. Oh yeah, evolution
yes,
when transmission occurs before disease. Okay, okay. So that sounds. So do we think that's something one should touch on in challenges for modelling?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Let me put that in my notes. That's not my notes.
Are you going to transfer your notes to this Slack channel and a set of challenges, do you think, Jess? Or...
Slack channel. I've stayed off Slack for so long because in my experience, it's how people try and make me do things. but what I might do is share a Google Doc.
Yeah, that would be good.
Does that work? I can do a Slack channel. I'm prepared to do a Slack channel for you, Valerie, but nobody else.
You could put a Google Doc in the Slack channel, of course, with a link. We were just trying for each challenge to sort of use the Slack channel as a place to sort of post ideas. I mean, I've also been trying to make a few notes, but I'm hopeless at making notes and listening. And I don't think they make much sense. So, and I think your notes are going to be a lot more useful.
Okay, I'll clean them up a bit and then throw them either to you guys or in the Slack, depending on whether I can figure out the Slack.
Good.
Okay. Are there any burning things we missed, or are we nearing people's
every rabbit
entropy levels? Every what?
Every rabbit hole has been explored.
There must be another rabbit hole.
Is there anybody still underground, do we think?
Yes, if we can get your comments into the Slack, and anything any of those involved want to add to that, we can then circulate them a bit more widely and get them in them, and maybe fix up a next discussion in maybe a couple of weeks' time, something like that.
I should think so. I mean,
So
sorry.
So I discussed a lot of this with Justin Lester, and I talked to him ahead of time. So would it be okay if we include him as well? He just hasn't had time to join the
Absolutely.
discussions. Yeah,
Yeah, of course.
great.
No, it would be really good to have his input. So,
Great. I shall bully him into it then.
I think I think in a way the best Challenges papers resulted where you got something like half a dozen people involved, and where they came from a number of different perspectives, so as to cover a range of slightly different flavored challenges. I think that would all be good. So yes, one or two more good people like Justin involved would be great.
Great. Maybe I can drag Brian in.
oh well, that would be
But
good
that might
too.
be might be
Might
tricky.
take a bit of doing.
Yes.
All right, good.
Okay,
Excellent to
so
see you all.
Thanks so much, all.
See you all
Thanks very
tomorrow.
much.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.